Hi, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex, here in Brussels at the European Development Days, and joined by Winnie Byanyima, who is, of course, the Executive Director of Oxfam International, and I think known to many of our readers. We've covered you before, we've interviewed you before on Devex, one of the big leaders of a major global NGO, so we appreciate you taking a few minutes with us today. I know one of the
Thanks,
themes,
Raj.
Thank you for being here, and I know one of the themes at this year's European Development Days is around the private sector. Of course, this is not a new theme, but in the last few years, a big upswell in the interest in finding ways for companies to work with the development sector. And I think one of the messages that you and Oxfam are bringing here is sort of a note of caution about this. I wanted to hear what that note of caution is and discuss that a little bit with you.
Yes, you know, Raj, today there is a lot of interest in the role of the private sector in promoting development. We at Oxfam, we are both excited but also skeptical about it. Why are we skeptical? Because the private sector, really, companies are primarily accountable to their shareholders, and their accountability to citizens at large has generally been weak. So we have a whole legacy of firms trampling on the human rights of poor people, especially damaging the environment. So unless you have a strong regulatory framework and you have strong incentives, firms do not naturally take care of the poorest and the most vulnerable and the environment. So you need accountable and effective governance for firms to play their role in development.
And do you feel that there is a sort of a movement against that effective regulation or governance? There's a sense that companies are now good actors and so we don't need that? Is that the reason Oxfam is talking about these issues at this point?
No, firms will not naturally be the protectors of the poor and the environment unless you have governments that are strong and capable. So in fact, as much as we want money from the private sector for development, our view is that the best way for companies to support development is to behave responsibly. So for us in Oxfam, we work with the private sector in very creative ways to encourage them to be responsible. For example, we have a program we call Behind the Brands. In that program, what we do is encourage companies, food companies, and score them against some really rigorous criteria on how they behave in their supply chains. Respect for women's rights, labor rights, environmental standards, land grabbing, 7 different indicators, and we score them, and this causes them to compete with each other and to lift the standards, to race to the top on their social and environmental impact. These are some of the creative ways we have for engaging with the private sector. But most importantly, firms should pay their fair share of taxes. That is the main way to get resources from firms.
Now, some people would argue that we are in a new era, that companies may have acted irresponsibly before, but there's a whole new generation of large global companies, many in Europe, many in the US, that have changed their mindset totally, and that they see responsible business practices as core to their competitive advantage. You partner with companies, are you seeing companies who are behaving in that way have changed their culture? Or is your message that that's still very few, and by and large, most corporations require strict regulation and more governance?
Oh no, we are seeing leaders in business, leaders that are coming out and showing that it is possible to get a good profit while also serving the broader social good and protecting the environment. And that's exciting. But I keep going back to the issue of standards, international standards. You have business standards by the United Nations, you have World Bank standards for corporates that work with them, performance standards. You have various standards that companies should adhere to in their business operations. That is the most important thing, that they respect human rights, that they respect the environment, that their business, their profit seeking does not trample on the rights of people. And for that, you need good government. So in fact, what we are saying is that as much as we want private money for development, we also want public money that encourages good private investment.
I see. And I'm curious about where the role of the NGO in all that. NGOs have played an important role in the last couple of decades as strong advocates. Oxfam is a great example, pushing society, pushing business, pushing government on a number of issues. Things are changing now. There's more of an era of partnership. That term is used more and more. Your own role and Oxfam International is to tie together all of the various Oxfam entities around the world. And there are many other NGOs with similar kind of global affiliations. Where do you see NGOs heading? What is the trajectory they're on in this new era?
Well, the development paradigm is shifting, and we are seeing that the geography of poverty has changed. Poor people used to be mostly in the low-income crisis countries. Now you have the majority of the poor in countries that are rich, India, China.
Yep.
So we are focusing more on inequality because we are dealing with poverty amidst riches in growth. So we're trying now to focus more on how do you make growth inclusive? How do you ensure that as a country is moving up, it's lifting all its people out of poverty? And that's different from taking money from rich countries to save those poor people in poor countries.
Right.
So we're changing the way we work as international civil society. We are rooting ourselves in the countries where we work, and we are raising money there, calling on the middle classes in the developing countries to take responsibility to hold their governments accountable on issues of inequality and environment, and also raising money from them to address issues of inequality in their own countries. That's a different way of engaging. It's a different model from collecting money from rich people in the north to bring to poor people in the south.
Agreed. We are in a much more complex world than where we used to be, and sort of said there's the third world and the rich world. We are in a much more diverse world now, and I think that has changed the way many NGOs operate. I just wonder, as we wrap up, we're here at European Development Days, so your message around governance and the importance of the role the public sector plays, what is that for the European Commission specifically, for Europe Aid? Do you feel that the large donor agencies like Europe Aid are funding the right things? Would you have a message to them about what they should be doing differently vis-a-vis the private sector or their portfolio in general?
Well, Europe has been going through a very difficult recession, and there's less and less traditional development assistance available. But what we are saying is that we can raise new resources. One of the main ways to do this is to stop the illicit flows of resources from the developing countries, and that also go past the European treasuries and are stowed away in tax havens. And so fight tax avoidance, tax dodging.
We had, sorry to interrupt, we had Eva Joly sitting in that chair yesterday, who chairs the Development Committee of the European Parliament, with the same message, saying tax havens should be a top priority for the development agenda.
Yes, and the whole bigger agenda of closing down the different ways that firms cheat on taxes. They cheat the developing countries, and they cheat the economies in the north because they don't put the money here in the treasuries. Then secondly, to look at new sources of financing, like a financial transactions tax. We've been calling for this, and some countries are now champions of this, like France, Germany. We want to see more European countries supporting a financial transaction tax. Some carbon taxation on international transport can raise a lot of money and also reduce carbon emissions, slow down global warming. So new sources of financing, look at that. And thirdly, maintain levels of development assistance. I know that is tough, but it's important that we address global problems together, the North and the South, because we are living on one planet.
And in the UK, where you sit, even the Conservative government has done that.
Absolutely.
They have ring-fenced their aid. We could talk about this much more, and I have many more questions for you. We will continue this conversation on Devex, and we thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us today.
Always a pleasure
Thank you,
to be
buddy.
with you.